So I'm here with Karl Dunkerley. Thank you very much for coming in today.
My pleasure.
You have brought in something for us which we really appreciate. It's a Commodore PET, but it's actually not just any old Commodore PET. Firstly, it's a Commodore PET from before our earliest one, and we can see it next to you there. But it's a Commodore PET 2001. Can you tell us how you come to have this machine?
Well, it started for me back in 1977. Tomorrow's World was religious viewing for me and my dad. So every Thursday night we'd be glued to Tomorrow's World. And in between all the other scientific breakthroughs, there suddenly appeared this Commodore PET. Now, I was only 15 at the time, so it didn't really mean a lot to me. But my dad's, Eric, his ears pricked up when they said it had 8 kilobytes of memory. Because he was a chartered accountant and he'd worked for motor distributors. And back in the 50s, they had the entire floor of a building with a mainframe computer that had 8 kilobytes, and they'd run a large part of the company on it. So by the late 70s, he'd set up his own petrol station business, which was a family firm I worked in. And as soon as he word 8 kilobytes, that was it. This was a real machine. We knew nothing about computers whatsoever. I do remember it was £695. So we put in an order immediately.
£695 was a lot of money then.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not £695 a day.
No. Today, God knows what that would be in modern money.
Yeah.
But it was either that or we did things like the payroll by hand, which would take 5 hours. Everything had to be done in triplicate. You had books that you had, tax tables you had to read up. You know, it was very time consuming, even for 30 staff. You know, it was a 5-hour job. And then writing everything out by hand, which is, in my case, often illegible. We wanted better control over the forecourts, the tanks, the pumps, the sales side of things. And my dad being a chartered accountant, obviously, that for him was key to running the business. He was always very innovative. We had in fact, we had the very first petrol station with a forecourt shop on it.
Okay.
So we had a 1,000 square foot supermarket in 1973 back up in Leyland. It doesn't exist anymore, but you know, it wasn't till the mid 80s that most petrol stations had a decent shop on them. So we were always fairly innovative. We did our own thing, you know, we came up with our own ideas. I probably started in the business when I was about 10 or 11. I certainly remember working in the school, in the business when I was at junior school and then grammar school. So anyway, we put the order in and we waited and we waited and we waited. And I honestly don't remember how long it was before it arrived, but it did make quite a dramatic entry because I looked outside the house and I saw this armed Securicore vehicle, and I'm going, what the hell's this? We don't have money pickups at the home, you know, we don't even do it at the petrol station. So I just saw 2 blokes with the visors on, the helmets, full riot gear almost, you might say, lugging this great big box up the drive. And I said, Dad, you better come and have a look at this. And they brought this big box. Unfortunately, we don't still have it, but it was probably about this big. And they said, we brought a machine for you. And we'd actually forgotten what was coming. It was been that long. I don't think it actually arrived till early 78, I'd guess. So we took it inside. On the first day, we dared unbox it. We found a space on a desk for it. We didn't even turn it on. I think we had to put our own plug on it.
Right, yeah.
And we had no idea, because in those days there were no books, there were no computer clubs. Internet wasn't even a dream at that stage. There were no TV programs. There was no one we could talk to about it. So basically I picked up the photocopied Commodore PET manual and just read it overnight, and the next day turned it on. We dared turn it on, and we literally, it was almost like lighting the blue touch paper. Were we going to blow the house up? We had no idea what this thing was going to do. So we sort of like switched it on and stood back as if to say, oh God, we're in trouble now. And then I started teaching myself how to program it.
Right.
As you can see, it had a cassette, and you needed a C12 cassette, 12-minute cassette. You had to demagnetize the heads on a regular basis. It would take several minutes to load a very small program. First thing I programmed was the payroll because of the amount of time it took every week to do it. And there were no formula. The tax office, didn't deal with you unless you were IBM or ICL or one of the big boys. So we chased all round their offices, Cumbernauld and everyone. Couldn't get the formulae to save our lives. And they're saying, who are you? Are you IBM? And I'm saying, no, we're just a little petrol station group in the Northwest. And they were going, what do you want these for? So in the end, we had to sit down and we actually had to reverse engineer from the tables how the formulae worked. And one of the problems was that sometimes it didn't tie up with what we were expecting, and that was because they were rounding the numbers.
Right.
So we even had to work out how to round the numbers. By this time, we joined one or two computer groups that were starting up. There was a good one at Merchant Taylor's school in Crosby. Later on, there was one at Southport Technical College, as it was then. We also got to know a programmer through that who gave us a lot of help, Noel, and it just kind of snowballed from there. I think later on in '78, I actually started computer O-level at the grammar school in Southport. And back then, there were no computers in school. They weren't even nobody even remotely thought about that. And by then, I'd been writing 1,000-line programs, 2,000-line programs. And it was a bit of a shock to go to school and start doing computer O-level. And you basically had to do punch cards. And that was quite a shock. In fact, I think we started on ticker tape.
Right.
And you write a 10, 20-line program, send it off to Liverpool University with all the others, and pray it came back and had worked. But it was a week or two before it actually came back with your printouts.
Yes, absolutely. So they were working with mini computers and mainframes.
Yeah, I think they were using VAXs and PDPs and stuff like that.
Yeah, at home you had a microcomputer.
Yeah, and at home I was writing, I was running a multi-million-pound business. There were no printers there, so initially we still had to write everything on pre-printed forms. There were no floppy drives like this one here. They didn't come in till later, so it was all on tapes, and you had to write the details down of the employee, put it back in the next week. And it was only really when the floppy drives came in that we could really start to cut the time down. So payroll processing, which typically took 5 to 6 hours a week, I think that went down to about 25 minutes once we got a printer and a floppy. So this was a massive saving in a small, we thought it was a small business, it was a family business. And that allowed us to do other things. Later on I started, with my dad, we worked out a program which worked out how the tanks and the pumps were working underground, because there were no electronic meters, no measurements underground. You had a brass dipstick which went into the ground. It was about 20 foot long, and it was accurate to the nearest few hundred gallons back then. That shows you how old it was. But what my dad had sussed was that although it sloshed around, if you took the average over a number of deliveries and you tied that against the pumps and what the readings were on there, you could work out whether either your pumps or your tanks were losing it or you were being short delivered fuel.
Right.
So, and in one case, we had a disagreement over a pump with the petrol wholesaler, who I won't mention. And they said, no, you got it wrong. There's nothing wrong with the pumps, blah, blah, blah. It's all, you've got it. And we were losing quite a lot of money on that pump. Margins were tiny. So they were like 4% gross and 1% net. So you lost £100. It was like losing 10 grand. So we went to a meeting with the rep, armed with these binders full of printouts over several months. And he said, right, we'll sort it. And that was the difference computers made in those days. From being really in the dark, being in the Stone Age, to suddenly being able to show stuff to people and they would go, wow, you know, no contest.
Mm. So a machine of sort of £700 nearly in cost saved itself time and time again in terms of what it saved you in money.
Well, I actually took a year out before going to college to do an ergonomics degree at Loughborough in order to program the rest of the systems.
Right.
So we also did one for the shop sales as well. So that meant we could see where we were making money, where we weren't making money, which depots were doing well, which ones weren't. If there were any stock losses, because back then stock taking was a bit of an art, you know, whereas we could then say, right, these are the sales over the 3 months, this is what we started with, this is what we've got now, we've lost X thousand pounds. So we could often tell when either customers or staff were, you know, on the fiddle, to be blunt. We then upgraded this one. We went to, I think, a 4032, eventually to an 8032, and ultimately to the Porsche designed 8096. So those 4 generations of PET served our company fantastically. God knows how much they saved over the years, how much money they made us, but you know, they were invaluable. They put us into a much higher league in terms of retail. You know, they allowed us to do things that, you know, people hadn't even dreamt of doing.
That's quite a thing to say. So those machines, those microcomputers back then gave you the edge over other companies that didn't have those.
Absolutely. Back in those days, there were really 3 computers. There was the PET, which was really for the business community. It was Commodore Business Machines. People forget that. There was also, later on in the UK anyway, the Apple II arrived, and that was in labs. I used them when I went to university. And there was the Tandy TRS-80, and that was the home one. And for me, that was like the Holy Trinity. You had the 3 markets covered. You had business, technical, and home. And that was why it led to an explosion in the computing market. And they're all around about the £600, £700, £800 mark, which was, although it's expensive, it was affordable.
Yeah, for business,
Not just for businesses. There were enough well-off individuals and universities that they could buy them. You know, if you imagine how much they saved in fees to, you know, other institutions to run their mainframes. So that Holy Trinity and that kind of price point really fed the explosion. And a lot of other people came in on the back of it, people like Sinclair. You had the Japanese wave of machines, which interestingly never took off. Everyone thought they were going to dominate the industry, and the Japanese machines never really made it.
Are these the things like the NECs and the MSX based machines, which are a little bit later? But
and we honestly thought they were, because Japanese at that stage were wiping out the motor industry and just about every other industry. So people thought they were going to wipe out the computer industry in this country, and it never really happened for some reason.
We had a very, very strong, in quotes, home computer industry in the late 70s, early 80s. We were doing things sort of most of the rest of the world weren't really picking up on.
And I think we relied a lot on Mavericks in those days. Whereas I think the Japanese tried to have a very corporate approach. This is how we'll do it. We'll all do it the same way. And again, because you had 3 machines aimed at different markets, very firmly different markets, you know, it just covered all bases. So we did really well. So did the Americans. You know, if you think about it, no other country really came close to the British and the Americans.
Home computing, nobody, not even the Americans actually. The Americans were very
much
more about
you'd have thought the
business.
Germans would have come up with something, or the Japanese in those days, but they didn't. You know, it was all British and American.
There was a lot going on with sort of government and the initiatives that were. I remember IT 82 was a whole push to get the general public aware of computers and computing and microcomputers anyway. But what you were doing though was still late 70s with the Commodore PETs. I mean the Porsche one was
used them probably into the 80s.
Yeah, the Porsche ones. So were you ever using the machines all together? Or was it just one machine at a time, just a replacement?
Yeah, it would typically be 2 at once,
right.
I would say. I don't think we ever had all 4, so we would migrate. Right. So I'd get a call back from college, I bought a new machine, can you come back and transfer everything over?
Because you get another machine, more memory, you write programs that use more memory, then it won't run on the poor old PET 2001.
One thing we couldn't afford when we had the Commodores was a hard drive.
Right.
I do remember seeing the first ones advertised. There was a Mator Shark.
Yes.
And it was 3,000, I can't remember if it was pounds or dollars, for 20 megabytes.
Yeah. We do have one at the museum.
I mean, my toaster has more power than that.
Yeah. It was massive.
You know.
We've got one in the museum, and,
Oh,
it's
right.
massive. It's about that long.
Yeah.
So
I seem to remember it looked rather like that.
It's a little bit more squared off than that.
Yeah,
but
I
it's
should
so
imagine.
deep. It hardly fits on a table. And it is incredibly heavy.
Yeah.
But hard disk was very,
I do remember
very big.
going around some of the corporate data centres, like Littlewoods, down in Liverpool, and they had all the big tapes going around like you'd see on the Sci-Fi and all that sort of thing, and incredibly noisy. And we'd go home and just be doing lots of stuff that, that they'd have a huge machine doing. And that was that told you the way the market was going.
So you started with the PET 2001 there, which is cassette based.
Yeah.
Moved on to, was it the 4096? 4032,
I think
okay,
it
so
was.
that's 32 came in. Did you have floppy drives on that, or were you still loading from the cassettes?
We had the original CompuThink drives. We didn't move on to the branded Commodore ones till later, partly because the CompuThinks, if I remember rightly, you had two drives, double-sided floppy drives, and they were 5 1/4 inch, not the little ones that most people think of, the hard ones.
Yep.
And they would hold 800 across all the sides. So that was enough for us.
Yeah.
And the one thing about having so little resources, it taught you to be efficient, and it taught you to be elegant and not verbose.
So what you should say there then is 800. That's 800 kilobytes.
800
For anybody watching now, we're not megabytes. Or anything beyond that, this is kilobytes.
No, certainly not gigabytes. That was, that was science fiction.
So were you creating sort of database kind of files, or was it more word processing sites?
In those days, there were no database systems, certainly not for micros. You had things like DBase came in much later, but that was in the 80s. So the only way you could store information on the floppies was to write long strings. So your first 10 characters would be the serial number, your next 10 characters would be the surname, and that was literally how you did it. And it was just a series of strings, and you had to know exactly where all the data was. So if you wanted to change the surname to, say, 20 characters, you had to rewrite the whole thing and use string manipulation. So you got to know left, right, mids very, very quickly. It was very low tech, but it was very effective.
Yeah, it worked.
It taught you to be economical.
Yeah.
Whereas you look at some systems now and they've got gigabytes and gigabytes, and you're thinking, they're not really doing that much more.
Well, yeah, the ultimate use in some ways, yeah. I mean, so you were programming these things in BASIC, Commodore BASIC,
in Commodore BASIC, yeah.
So you had to get to grips with that from day one. You had your manual, the blue coloured sort of
That's
photocopied style manual, and you just read through that and started typing in code. Yeah,
I just followed. The first ones were just what came in the manual. In fact, I think there were 1 or 2 bugs in them we discovered. So, so you quickly learnt to
they were to teach you
code. Yeah, that was it. See who was the idiots and who spotted the mistakes. It wasn't massively complicated. It taught you to be very logical, to think things through step by step, and to think about it from a user again, because you didn't have a lot of power. It just had to do what you needed. You couldn't put a lot of frippery on it or anything that was confusing, because you couldn't go, if you really messed up and you're at the end of the payroll, you'd have to go back to the beginning. So, it taught you to think very carefully before you programmed anything. Nowadays, a lot of people do rush in and they end up with a bit of a mess if they're not careful. But you had so few resources, you had to be very careful. You had to be sure that the code made sense. And there were no subroutines then, it was all line numbers. So you had to say, right, lines 45,000 to 49,999, they're going to be one block of code, and you'd have to write a go-to to it. And then you'd have to do the if-then to get back to where you wanted to go next.
Did the PET have a Go sub as well? Was there a Go sub?
Oh,
No, they didn't have a Go sub at that time.
No, that was...
So you couldn't even jump back to where you knew you were.
No.
Oh, well. Oh, okay. So
So
that made
this
a bit
is
of a
it.
bird's nest of code.
You really had to know what you were writing. You really had to understand it. And because I'd done all the systems manually, that helped. Nowadays, you tend to have a bit of a divorce between programmers and users. Whereas in the early days, because there were no payroll programs, there were no pumps, tanks, reconciliation programs, we wrote it based on our experience. So the programmer was the user. So it had to be efficient. If not, you just changed it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Ultimately, you end up with a piece of software that did exactly what you want.
Yeah.
You know, with no ifs and buts, it is exactly
And
right.
I've often wondered, I actually did ergonomics at Loughborough University as my first degree. And I've often wondered whether programming would be a lot better if you made programmers use the systems for 2 or 3 months before they started programming, because then it would force them to really think, not be told what's needed, but they would actually experience it and they would see what wasted time and what was a pain in the arse and what worked and what didn't. And I do wonder whether you'd get better programming, you know.
Well, I've watched quite a few interviews with people that have been involved in, creating electronic products and writing code. And so many people, the successful stuff, they wrote it for themselves in the first place. And it just happened to be that it's something that other people wanted too. And, you know, when you are doing it from that respect and trying to create something that you will find useful.
They really knew what they were writing about.
Yeah.
You know, they were writing from personal experience, and it doesn't matter whether it's a book or whether it's code. If you've lived it and you have to do it day in, day out, you know, you really think about it. If you're programming on behalf of someone else, you don't have that first-hand feel for it. And I do think that makes a difference.
No, it definitely does. Definitely does. So, going on from the Commodore PET, you'd learned to code on there. Where did that take you? Did you end up within programming industry, or?
No, I kind of burnt out on the programming after 3 or 4 years, when you sort of like realise you went to bed at 3 in the morning, you got up at 9 a.m. and you carried on coding for 18 hours, and you'd see the neighbours taking his dog for a walk at midnight, and then you'd see him at 9 o'clock and 8 o'clock in the morning, and you suddenly realise you're getting a bit too addicted. So I did pull away from that, and as I say, I went off to do university. By then they had the Apple IIs, but they were still using VAXs and PDP-11s at Loughborough University. I used it in some respects, either for statistics, so we were using Ministat, SPSS, all those early stats programs. One of them I did was a psychological test, and there's a test of dexterity and thinking, where you have a mirror and you have to trace round a star, but do it in reverse, and it's to see how well your brain how flexible your brain is. And I used a very early digitizing pad. I think it was linked to an Apple II, and I worked out how to tell when people were in and outside the line, and that took quite a few weeks. That was quite a program to write, because you had to work out where the points were to do the calculations to whether you were in or out. That was fun.
Yeah, I bet.
One thing I did find very early on was that a lot of people, certainly when I was at school, the teachers then, because I was one of the very first, possibly one of the very first who went to school with programming knowledge, the teachers then had been treated as gods because they knew computers. You know, nobody else did. Nobody else in the school did. It was typically maths teachers. And I learnt very early on that they didn't like upstarts suddenly coming into their school and telling them how to program. And I did get in trouble a few times for asking questions they couldn't answer. And I think what happened in the 80s, and I think this was a big mistake, was that a lot of the teachers felt they were being outgunned by the pupils. As the ZX came in, the Acorns, the BBC Micro, and the kids suddenly became the programmers. They were doing it in the bedrooms, and they were coming to school with stuff that the teachers didn't understand. And I think the teaching profession kind of recoiled from that. and gave up trying to compete with the kids or trying to teach them programming. And I do think we made a big mistake for something like 20 years in pulling back, just teaching them Word and Excel and stuff like that. Because computing teaches you to think. It teaches you to put yourself in the shoes of the user. It teaches you to think logically, to look at sequences, to look at where you branch off. And it's incredibly useful in so many areas. And I remember working in a large comprehensive in the 1990s, and I couldn't believe they were just teaching them to use computers and not program, and I was very, very disappointed in that. And I think we lost a generation, you know, almost an industry.
Yeah, we did.
You know, we could have been so much stronger in that, and it seems to be coming back.
It is. Yeah, things are changing.
I gather they're changing the curriculum, and I'm quite glad for that because, you know, for me it was a good experience, and you learnt things that help you in other parts of your life.
Absolutely.
So when there's a problem, it taught you to problem solve. It taught you to look at the problem, to look at different people's angles on the problem, and to say, right, let's try this. This looks like it'll work. This sequence may work, and then test it afterwards.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I do think we lost that for a long time. And
We
I
did.
feel,
But like you say, things are changing. It's a key part of what we do at the museum. Is try and engage another generation with the programming and the electronics. It is starting to happen again. It's actually just a big repeat of the 80s in a way. The teachers have still got the same worries and things. We try and help them, get across the fact that actually, it doesn't matter if they know more. They will. It's an industry where it's always going to be the same. What you need to do is just enthuse them, help them go along that way. If you don't know how to do it, then just say, well, I don't know, but now we've got the internet, now we've got the web. All the information's on there, and it's just pointing in the right direction.
Well, after the PETs, we did eventually move on to PCs, but in the meantime, the big change for us was the rise of proper programs. So things like Superscript for word processing, because there was no Microsoft Office back then. I don't think Word had been invented at that stage. There was VisiCalc, the early spreadsheet, and there were a few of these programs. Things like DBase came in, but not on the Commodore. So later on, we did move on to using them. Being an accountant, my dad was very avid on the spreadsheets. I did a lot of writing on the early word processors. We got an Amstrad, and we went on to the Quill, to Abacus, and the other Scion programs, and eventually I became chairman of the Scion users group. So I got to meet the top bods there, and they were lovely programs. This was Mac style interface, pre-WIMPs as they called it back then. Windows, icons, mouse and pointers.
Menus and pointers,
and then it later became the GUI, didn't it? So, and they were very nicely designed because they told you on the screen what your options
much
were.
more intuitive for somebody that didn't know the program.
And I thought it was a great shame when those programs died a death. They were very nice to use, very intuitive. I also used a QL, because I loved the programming language on that. It was a very, very nice, elegant programming language. And you could do a lot with the graphics, but unfortunately the microdrives let it down very badly. They were really unusable, very difficult to use. You didn't know whether it was going to get chewed up each time. So
taking a chance with your data, weren't you?
You did. You really took a chance.
A game of roulette.
And it was a shame, really, because that was such a nice machine. It was such a nice programming language. I did Fortran, a bit of Pascal, and COBOL as part of university and other things. I even did some assembly language at Southport College. That was interesting. Yes. Later on, I went into journalism. So after we closed the business down, as my dad retired in the early 1990, I think it was, we closed the business down. In the meantime, I had written a government report for the Select Committee in Parliament, and that was about 120 pages long. and that was written on superscript.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, and that went to a select committee hearing. So, you know, back then, even word processors, you could do a lot with them.
Oh, yeah.
You know, printers were quite archaic. Our very first printer was a teletype, and it had been taken from an airline terminal.
Right.
And anybody who remembers the old Saturday afternoon final score programme with this clunking great golf ball going will know exactly how it sounded. But imagine that in a small office, and it was solid lump of iron. I mean, you know, you had to be careful lifting it.
Yeah.
We didn't move it very often. The interface was, you know, something from the 60s probably. And when we were printing the payroll, we used to just leave the room because the noise, it was like being sat next to a machine gun. You know, it was brrr, it was awful. And the metal shelving we had on would literally shake.
I was on metal shelving as well, it made it even worse.
Oh, God, yeah, I'm not joking. It was shelving we'd taken out the supermarket that we didn't need anymore. And I'm not joking, the reverberation, you could feel it through the floor and the seat. So we'd just go off and make a coffee for 20 minutes while it went through. And it was on a big roll of paper we had stuck around the back. Later on, we got a Cume daisy wheel printer, which was basically had a plastic head with the font on. You couldn't change the font size without, you had to change the wheel. Same with the golf ball, you had to change the golf ball. You couldn't say, I want 12-point font or 24. You had to physically open the machine up, stick it in, put the ribbons in, you know, and then leave it to burst your eardrums, basically. We got a very early dot matrix printer, and that was this wide, yay! So we could print all our graphs and tables out and everything, and that was quite luxurious. And that was sort of like, zzz, it's like having a million mosquitoes in your ear rolls. So that was a totally different sound, both quite annoying, but the soundproofing hoods did work.
Right.
So they weren't quite as violent towards your eardrums as that original golf ball. That was a killer. And it's just been interesting to see how the technology has changed over the years.
So you were writing for some fairly prominent magazines?
Yeah, at one stage I was technical editor just for a short while of Personal Computer World magazine. We'd bought the very first issue back in, I don't know, 1978, and we'd bought it ever since. I nearly went to PC magazine, but I decided to go to PCW because we'd read it since the beginning. So I'd run laboratory tests of, say, 50 computers, that sort of thing. Living in London initially wasn't to my taste, so I moved back up north and moved to, again, a PC publishing company up in near Macclesfield. So, and I got into writing in quite a big way for probably about 10-15 years. I also wrote for the very first desktop video magazine. My father had always been into photography since the late 50s. He'd done his national service, won a camera in a poker game. And in those days, you didn't have chemicals and dark labs, so he basically built his own.
Right.
And I won't tell you how he got hold of some of the chemicals. My mother would be shocked if I said that on camera. It was very anatomical. So basically, you know, he was doing colour photography, I think, in the early 60s at home.
Right.
And eventually he decided to go into video. So originally it was different decks and you just mix the tapes. And then he decided to move into desktop video. I'd moved away by this stage, so I wasn't living in Southport. And every so often I'd get a call up and they'd be, Karl, I've bought a new desktop video program, can you come home? So that was my weekend blown. And luckily it meant that I could pick up some work on writing as a freelance journalist for desktop video magazines.
Right.
So I wrote some of the early articles. And we got into video editing. He joined a video editing club in Southport. He did one on the local airfield, Woodvale. And he got some very good footage, and he laid down all the footage, but he didn't have a narrative. So having worked as a journalist, guess who got to write the narrative? So it also meant I could edit in some of the music and everything else. So that was the first video editing I did on a computer.
This probably, we need to say how this was done though, because to a lot of people thinking about video editing now, this is all on a sort of a non-destructive timeline on a computer.
Oh, you do it on your laptop now, or even on your phone almost.
Yeah. But this is...
But back then, this was VHS tape decks, or Super VHS as my dad had. So we'd have 3 or 4, you'd have monitors for each of the tape decks. You'd have a little console where you did the wipes and the titling, and you had to sync the signals between the different machines, because that wasn't done in one machine. Then when the desktop video came in, the most expensive thing, apart from the video boards, and these were big video boards that went into, you had to have dedicated almost data center type PCs to put them in, because they were full length, you know, and the computers, the PCs weighed a ton. And then you had SCSI discs that you'd stack up. We had stack of, I think they were called, wasn't Necropolis or Acropolis or something like that.
Right, yeah.
You know,
Micropolis.
Yeah, they had like 20 or 30 megabytes on each. And I remember we had quite a few at one stage. And there, you know, you'd suddenly had 2 or 3 computer monitors instead of TV monitors. So you could then see which was coming in on the left, what was coming on the right, and you'd start to mix it down on the timeline. It wasn't in real time. It's not like you see it now, you know, where you edit it and it's done almost instantly. And it's almost done while you're working out the edits. Back then, you know, you'd spend an hour or 2 working out the edits and then let it compile it out to a drive. And it could take ages and ages to do. And you never knew whether it worked. So it was in some ways like going back to the original, you know, the late 70s with the PETs, where you just had to suck it and see. And if it didn't work, you had to go back and redo the timeline. And the amount of hours you spent on it was phenomenal. Stuff that you do in 5 seconds now. So
you were doing it by dubbing from tape to tape in the first place, but then and then moving on to actually video capturing, by the sounds of it, on the PCs, or was it just processing? Or
yeah, you basically fed the Super VHS signal into the board, and then you captured it to the hard drive, and then you edited it. So capturing the video took, you know, however long the tape was, and then you had to go through the tape and see what was where, and it could take ages just going through all the footage and working out what you wanted to keep, what you didn't.
And probably needing to get rid of straight away the stuff you didn't need, because there was just wasn't hard drive space. Yeah, because, you know, you were still you were still not in the gigabytes and terabytes, you know, territory you are now. I remember, because I was working at places like Personal Computer World, I remember some of the very early video graphics boards. And I remember that the first pictures were like, moving pictures were like that big. And then they suddenly got to that big. And eventually they got that big. And I'll tell you, it was a very exciting time to be in computing in the 90s, especially working as a freelance journalist, because things would just suddenly appear on your desk or get sent to your home. And it's not like now where, you know, a new version of Word comes out and everybody goes, so what? You know, back then, you know, going from that size of video image to that size, to being able to embed it on web pages, you know, each of these was a major breakthrough, you know, and now it's almost like Lawnmower Weekly in some respects. You know, it feels more incremental now. Back then, it felt like, you know, every time you got a board through the post, this was potentially something changing the game, you know, and you didn't know at the time which game changes there were. I remember being invited to the first NVIDIA demonstration. And then, back then, the computer graphics were, you know, they were fairly low res, they were very slow, they were a bit, you know, jittery, you might say. And they showed you these NVIDIA boards working, and I think it was Thomson and NVIDIA. This must have been in the mid-90s. And suddenly they were, you know, showing terrains and flying over them, and,
and it was way beyond anything you'd seen up to that point. And now, practically everything high-end is NVIDIA, but back then nobody had heard of them. So you suddenly saw these things come from nowhere and take over an industry in, 1 to 2 years.
Must have been a great position to be in as well, because you're getting all these boards sent to you. So
it was brilliant.
It's like being in a sweet shop.
At one stage, Sony sent me an editing suite, and it was back in the days when you didn't have flat screen TVs. So these were the really big cathode ray tubes. And it was huge. And it came like flight case packed, like a rock concert. And it took 3 of us to get these into the basement of my house to be able to set them up, because they were just so heavy. People forget just how big and heavy everything was back then. And, it took 3 of us to get them down the stairs, and it took me about 2 days to get them out of the boxes and set them up on the desks. It was, knackering. But it was also quite good fun, because you were doing stuff that, probably no one else had done outside Sony or outside whoever was supplying you with the kit. And it was a very, very exciting time, the 80s and the 90s. And we're almost a bit blasé about it now. When everything's in your pocket and on your phone, you kind of lose that wow factor, I think.
Yeah. No, there was a lot of
It
wow
was a
going
really
on.
good time to be a computer journalist. Yeah. Probably the best time was the 90s, because you just didn't know what was going to land on your desk from one day to the next. And then there was the first murmurings of the internet, which I remember, and people sending emails, and why would you want to do that when you can pick up a phone? I remember going to an exhibition at Olympia, really can't remember when, but it would have been in the 90s sometimes. And people forget how big the computer shows were, and then they were massive. They were multi-floored. I went to CeBIT once in Hanover, and I was knackered. I'm not joking. I just collapsed in the evening, because it was in 12 halls. It was just ginormous.
They were full of pizzazz as well, weren't they?
And there was so much noise, and you had to fight to get on some stands. Luckily, as a journalist, I knew a lot of the people who, from the companies like Sony and Fast and all those kind of desktop video companies, and I could get on the Microsoft stand, because you get taken to Seattle every so often, that sort of thing, when they had a big launch, which was very nice. But this one time at Olympia, I was sat in the cafe, half collapsed, trying to work out what I was going to write out, because your head was exploding with so many different things you'd seen. And on the next table there was this chap dressed like a rep, and he'd keep taking this big lump of something out of his briefcase, and he'd then start dialing on it, and I'm not joking, it was like that big. It was a real breeze block brick. It was huge. And then he'd be phoning the office, and everybody would be turning around and watching him. And interestingly, I was sat there for about half an hour, and he kept doing this every 5 minutes. And I think that was his marketing strategy.
Nice.
This was a very, very early mobile phone, and I'm not so sure it was classed as mobile. You probably ended up with repetitive strain syndrome in your arms. I remember the very first portable computers, like the Osborne 1. I remember them coming in, and I'd have loved one. But A, I didn't like the idea of taking around cathode ray tubes. But B, they called them portable. Most people called them transportable or luggables, because they were so heavy. People have no concept of, you almost had to be a bodybuilder to carry some of these early things around. And you had to be careful you didn't drop them or whatever. So it was amazing to see the speed of technology change, and you really didn't know from one day or 1 year to the next what was going to come through.
A lot of things came out that you just weren't expecting. Like you say, probably especially within graphics and media storage and things like that, things just got so. The one thing I remember, I don't know if you had the same sort of problem. If you did, it would have been a way bigger problem than I ever had. Whenever you got a new graphics card, or it was less so on graphics card, more about sound cards and capture cards and things like that. It's configuring IRQs and DMAs.
Oh God,
and things.
yeah.
It
I was
killed
just
me
as soon
doing
as you
it.
said that, I thought IRQs.
Yeah, you must have spent all your life changing those around with new cards all the
I
time.
kind of had an advantage by that stage because of being a computer journalist. I knew the people, like Nicholas Joanne at one of the video graphics companies, and the people behind FAST. So being a computer journalist, I could actually ring up the technical department and go,
that's not fair.
for God's sakes, what IRQ do I want, or what do I do with this, and why isn't this working? So I was kind of lucky. I had a bit of a hotline, but I did feel sorry for a lot of people.
They were quite hard to configure, weren't they? You know, port numbers, IRQs, DMA channels. I spent a lot of time. And the problem is, you would read the instructions for one card and you would do it as that one card wants.
Yeah.
It just happens to conflict with the other card
conflicts
that they hadn't thought that you might have or whatever.
I mean, the concept of plug and play was, when it came in, everyone was, oh, please let it work.
Yeah.
It took a few years for it to work.
Well, it's exactly as you'd done then. It was plug and pray, wasn't it?
It was. You really did pray to the gods of computing, you know. It was quite frightening. So the amount of times you could spend, and I always knew when, you know, if my dad phoned me up and go, okay, what's wrong now? And I'd have to hike it over from Sheffield, or if I was up from London that weekend, and I'd be on my hands and knees plugging cables in and moving stuff off the shelves and trying to resolve conflicts, and you just go, oh my God, that's my weekend completely blown.
You did. You spend more time trying to configure these things than you did using them. I mean, plug and play was great towards the end of it, but it really just meant a lot of that configuration was moved onto a user interface where you could do it from the screen. Because before that, you know, it was on the card. These were little jumpers on the card, weren't they?
Oh, yes.
You know, you'd change the jumper, you'd put the lid back on, you'd put the monitor back on the box, and you'd try it out.
And you prayed you didn't break anything
Well,
either, you know, because those little blocks you could actually break quite easily.
Drop them in the machine and all sorts,
So they taught you to be resilient and to make sure you had a good circle of friends who really knew what they were doing. So you'd be phoning, Mike, can you help me with this one? And he'd phone you up and you'd phone him, and you know, and I really enjoyed it at the time.
So he's still in journalism now? Or
No, I moved on to be a business analyst.
Okay.
So kind of...
And is that purely from the business point, or is that is using tech within business? Or
basically, for the last 10 years, I've worked mainly as an IT business analyst.
Right.
I'd done a lot on documentation, and with my journalism background, I moved into a lot of technical writing. Worked for the BBC when News Online started. In fact, when I joined, they were just about finalising the software. So I got to know a lot of the early players, people like Matt Carris, who designed the original News Online, Bob Eggington, who was the programme director. And it was a project that had been kicking around the BBC for 2 or 3 years, and it had various big tech companies in, and they'd just not got it right, and they hadn't really got their heads around it. Bob Eggington was given the job, and he went to Matt Carris, who was at Line 1, one of the ISPs at the time, and he put a team together, and I think they'd cracked it within about 3 to 4 months. So I came in purely as a technical writer at the BBC. This was late 97. And there were 2 of us. I was there to write for the users because of my journalism background, so I could write for, you know, a wide audience, because the people coming in were journalists. They weren't going to be technical people. They wanted people who could write for the web. There was another guy who was brought in to do the technical side of the writing, but he left after a couple of weeks, so I took over both sides. And as the first BBC journalists came on board, they needed somebody to train them. So I ended up training probably the first 100 BBC News Online journalists, and including the World Service. I did the Mandarin service, the Arabic service, and the Spanish World Service as well. Wow. And I also worked with one of the top editors at the News Online then, to write the online journalist handbook, to teach people what the guidelines were for writing on the web. Because I got a lot of people who were print journalists coming along. I got a lot of people who'd done pieces to camera, very few of them had ever written for the web. We had a content management system, which was what Matt and his team had written. Relatively easy to use, a lot easier than anything I'd seen in print journalism. So you could put video, photos, text together fairly quickly. And again, journalists, they would be print journalists. They might have nothing to do with photos, so they didn't know how to crop a photo, right? They didn't know what size to make it. They never worked on video editing, you know, and I had to teach them how to do all that. Again, because I'd been a journalist, I'd been a techie, I'd done desktop video, and I'd always done a lot of, like, I wouldn't call it photoshopping, but I'd always done a lot of image manipulation. Yeah. I was one of the few people who could actually see it and tie it to the journalist, to their needs. So I'd often get journalists come in the morning, and I'd take them through what it was all about, very gently teach them how to, you know, use whatever the graphics program was to crop it to the right size, how to the kind of length of the story that they needed to shorten their paragraphs, especially if they were broadsheet journalists, you know, how to write in a way that was clear and keep it down to a certain length.
Yeah, it's that kind of bite-size. Writing on the web is actually quite different, isn't it, from
it certainly was
else.
For the people that were coming in, because many of them were purely print journalists, so they'd be writing long pieces for a broadsheet, and suddenly they had to write it in a few hundred words. You had to write the captions yourself. You had to write the headlines yourself. It did go off to a sub, but typically, you know, you were the all-in-one journalist. All of a sudden, you know, even if you didn't take the video, you were the editor. You had to choose what bit of the video was most important.
That's an interesting point, because it's not only in on the web in terms of sort of news online as we're talking, but the newspaper industry changed dramatically because of these all changes because of computers. And all of a sudden, journalists were expected to do a lot more than journalists ever were before. You know, now they are, like you say, they're editing the videos. They're cropping images.
They were basically reporters. They wrote down what happened. There might be a photographer with them. There might be a video cameraman with them, but they wouldn't dream of doing it all. I did do a course with the BBC. It was a week-long course, and it was to teach you to be a one-man video news gathering crew. So you had to wander around the streets of London doing vox pops and then go and write it up and all this sort of thing. So it was at the point where it was changing, you know, where people really were becoming multi-skilled. And some of the journalists picked it up like a duck in water, and others really struggled. Some after a couple of hours I could leave them to go away and do it, and some I'd have to spend the whole day. We did get some of the BBC news correspondents, the ones you saw on the news every day, come in and try and learn this, and one struggled. I think it took me 2 days to get it into his head how to do it. Others picked it up straight away. But the one thing I do remember is, because we were in television centre, the one thing I always did was say, would you like to go for a wander? Because most of them had never worked in television centre. So they'd come from the regions, or they'd come from other industries or other organisations. So I'd say, you know, about halfway through, I'd say in the morning, I'd say, would you like to go for a tour? So I used to take them on a tour of television centre. And it's a shame they closed it.
I was going to say, and no
it
more
was
now.
A wonderful place to work. I remember my first day there, me and this other guy went and sat down in the cafe, and about 20 teenagers came in, painted head to toe in gold and brown, wearing loincloths and carrying spears. It was a crazy kind of place. I used to love walking around the back where they had the, what they called the donut, which is where they had all the studios that they filmed in. You'd see the props and you wouldn't believe how crude they were. You know, things like Newsnight, you'd think, oh really, they'll have spent a fortune on this set. And it was carpet squares stuck on a piece of plywood. You know, but on the TV it looked fine.
Absolutely, yeah.
You know, but the one thing that really got their attention was when I said, would you like to go to see the Blue Peter Garden? And everybody wanted to see that. A lot of them weren't that bothered about the studios or the other bits. As soon as you said Blue Peter Garden, that was it. Everybody wanted to go and see the Blue Peter Garden, which was just out back of where we were.
Fantastic.
So that was I enjoyed working at the BBC.
Yeah.
I think I did about 5 different contracts for them over 2 years. Probably in terms of technology, the standout one was Kingswood Warren. To anyone who knows the BBC, they'll know Kingswood Warren was the Research and Development Centre down in Surrey, just off the M25 near Gatwick. And it was like an old baronial hall, probably mock Victorian. They had croquet lawns, and it was run like an old public school. You had long benches where you went and sat in the refectory and this sort of thing. And I worked on one of the replacements for CFAX. So it was, the online text. And I worked on 2 or 3 projects. And it was such a weird and wonderful place to work. You'd look through the windows and you'd see men in white lab coats with big piles of equipment putting things in. And this was in the 90s, so it was still all plugging stuff in. They had an anechoic chamber to cut out all the sound. They did all the radio mast sightings so they could work out where to stop the masts interfering with each other. And they were inventing technologies, things like video on the move, mobile video, and you were seeing stuff that was probably that big. And you knew that in 10 years' time when it hit the streets and it was in people's homes, it was probably going to be that yay big, and they were so far ahead of their time. It was a wonderful place to work. Although in the reception, one thing they did have was the old BBC Two spinning globe, and you could actually press the button. It was in a perspex cage or glass cage, and you could just press the button and it would go round and round and you could see the reflection on the back. And what you'd always assume was graphics, you suddenly realise it was just a camera pointing at this globe and somebody pressed the button in the intervals. It was quite a fascinating place to work.
It's so far removed, isn't it, from how we do things today. And
it was just unbelievable. Whenever they had an open day, they'd put down big boards on the croquet table and land the helicopters there. So it was like something out of a sci-fi movie where all the mad geniuses worked. And I did really enjoy working there. That was a fascinating place.
Brilliant.
And it's a shame it's gone. I don't know what they've replaced it with. But I saw some of the original digital TV before digital TV launched. And they had one room in Television Centre. And it was just wall-to-wall TVs. They must have had about 100 TVs in there. And it was just to see how the signals worked on different brands.
Right.
And to see if there were any issues. So it was a wonderful time to work for the BBC, the late 90s. Massive amounts of change.
Yeah.
And they really did know where the eggheads were.